I'm Tom Hughes-Hallett, and welcome everyone to the London School of Economics' Faith Centre. I'm here to meet an extraordinary person, Dr Georgette Bennett. And I'll just say that my role in this is to learn more about her wonderful story and to help you hear about her amazing new book, Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By. I'm the co-founder of the Marshall Institute with Sir Paul Marshall, and this is just an absolute privilege, Georgette, to meet you.
Thank you so much, but the privilege is mine.
Thank you. I thought I'd introduce you by, since we're sitting here in London, by quoting one of our own fellow Brits, David Miliband, who...
I'm a great fan of his.
I know you are, and so am I. He says of you, Georgette Bennett has turned her life story into a force for humanity. When she sees suffering, she takes personal and moral responsibility to do something about it. The world needs more people like Georgette Bennett. So I thought that was a nice way to introduce you and to ask you to tell us about the journey to Thou Shalt Not Stand By.
Well, David was very generous, and I'm happy to share the journey. So I'll start my journey from the middle of it. And that begins with my late husband, Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, who was a pioneer in the field of interreligious relations and a well-known human rights activist. One of the things about which he was the most passionate was the plight of refugees. And because of that, he served for many years on the executive committee of the International Rescue Committee. So when he died, I wanted to honor that commitment of his, and I took his seat on the board of IRC. In 2013, IRC issued a report on the Syrian crisis. And being a typical overextended New Yorker, that report sat on my desk unread for 5 months. But when I read that report, it changed my life. Mm-hmm. I was stunned by the magnitude of the crisis, and I was stunned by the silence of the world. Mm-hmm. The silence of the world is something that resonated for me because I'm a child of the Holocaust, and the world was silent then too. Mm-hmm. And I'm a refugee myself, so I resonated deeply with the experiences that Syrians were having and the absolutely horrific conditions under which they were living.
Can I ask you, at what age were you a refugee?
I was a very young refugee. I was 6 years old.
Do you remember it?
I do remember it.
Yeah.
And I remember the feeling of displacement.
Yes.
And for most of my life, I have been searching for the roots that I lost. So even though I was very young when we arrived in the US as stateless refugees, it had a lifelong impact on me. When we arrived in the US, we arrived in McCarthy's America. And having come from a communist country, and of course McCarthy was obsessed with rooting out communists. We weren't communists, but Hungary was a communist country. And going into the post office or any government building, there was always a sign, you know, aliens must register. And that was me, you know, I was an alien. So, yes, I remember.
Yeah, yes. So you read the report. You're an overextended New Yorker with form, if you like. You'd experienced being an alien, as you describe it. What happened next? How did you become obsessed? Was it an obsession?
It wasn't an obsession. It was a commandment. Yeah. My religion commands me to respond in the face of suffering. I'm a Jew. and Leviticus 19:16, thou shalt not stand idly by while the blood of your neighbor cries out from the earth, is in our sacred texts. And that just kept reverberating in my brain as I read this IRC report, thou shalt not stand idly by. And that's why the title of my book is Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By.
And so you're sitting in New York, thousands of miles away from Syria. Had you ever been to Syria in your life?
I hadn't been to Syria myself, but the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, which is an organization I founded in 1992, actually did some work in Syria several years before the outbreak of that war.
And so most people, like 99.9% of the planet, would think, well, I'm just one person, that's a long way away. I'm not really sure how I can help. Perhaps you felt the same, but how did you find, when you and I talked on the telephone across the Atlantic last week, you talked about finding your niche, your place, your entry point, I think
Yes.
were the words used. Tell me a little bit about that. How did you find your entry point?
Yes, so I found my entry point in a way that was not duplicative of what other organizations were doing. Because I'm Jewish, first of all, I thought it was important for there to be a Jewish communal response to this crisis. Now, that might seem counterintuitive because through no fault of their own, Syrians are indoctrinated to hate Israel, to hate Jews. They're indoctrinated to believe that Israelis want to kill them and drive them off their land, and that Jews are the devil because Jews support Israel. Well, not all Jews support Israel. But I couldn't help but notice that Israel shared a border with the 4 most affected countries by this crisis, including Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan.
Not having got a geography O-level in my exam, that was one of the things I learnt from your book, was just how many borders Israel has got. Yeah.
That's right. And so it seemed natural to me that there was a great deal that Israel could do in response to this very, very complex crisis, even though Syria and Israel are technically in a state of war. But Israel is very well resourced in terms of search and rescue, in terms of medical research, in terms of medical devices. Their agriculture is very successful. So there's a tremendous amount that I felt Israelis could do if Syrians were willing to accept the help. So I saw an opportunity there not only to alleviate this terrible suffering of the Syrian people, but to build bridges that could plant the seeds for future stability in the region. So my entry point was mobilizing the Jewish community and working to get proactive action on the part of Israel. Now, I must say that Israel was already treating injured and ill Syrians who were coming to the border. It set up a field hospital in the north and was taking care of them. That wasn't always a safe thing to do. First of all, the IDF were risking their lives. The Israeli Defense Forces were risking their lives bringing the Syrians in. But I remember one episode, which I talk about in the book. There was one Syrian brought in who was very seriously injured and had to have surgery performed immediately. They had to cut open his clothes in order to access his wounds. And a metal object fell out of his pocket as they were doing that, landed between the surgeon's legs. And that metal object turned out to be an unexploded grenade.
Yes.
So this wasn't always a safe thing to do.
No.
So Israel was already doing that.
Yes.
But I saw that as being reactive
Yes.
rather than proactive.
Yeah.
So I set about, and this was not by myself, because at this point I started meeting the people who would eventually become my partners. One was the founder of an Israeli NGO that was operating below the radar, giving aid to Syrians. The other was a Syrian refugee himself. And the three of us went on the road and started doing briefings, the UK Parliament, the Canadian Parliament, every level of government in Israel, Congress in the US, because we thought that it would be very effective and very efficient to deliver aid into Syria through Israel. And so we were advocating for Israel being used as a staging area for the outbound delivery of international humanitarian aid. Of course, there were no takers, because politically, in many quarters, Israel is just considered too toxic, and people were not willing to rise above the politics to address something that could really be beneficial from a humanitarian point of view.
And at that sorry to interrupt you, at that stage, were the Syrian government aware of what you were doing, do you think?
No. At no point did we work with the Syrian government, because once I found an entry point, the next job was to identify a gap that was not being filled
And the gap
by
was?
others. The gap was, at that time, southwest Syria,
Yeah.
which is an area with a population of 1.3 million people.
Yes.
Southwest Syria was entirely surrounded by regime-held areas, and the regime did not permit any humanitarian aid to go to areas it did not control. So this was a hard-to-access area from anywhere but Israel. It was very easy to access from Israel. All you had to do was go over the Golan Heights.
Yeah.
So that was the gap that I identified. And after identifying a gap, you have to find something that is actually doable and then stay focused on that. So this eventually became very doable. In 2016, Israel announced as official government policy, Operation Good Neighbor. I have no idea whether that was the result of our lobbying or whether the government came to that decision by itself. I don't care. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that it happened. Because with Operation Good Neighbor, Israel was ready to facilitate the delivery of massive amounts of aid directly into Syria. It was waiving all customs duties and commissions. That's very important, because if you go through Jordan, for example, the government takes a very hefty commission for humanitarian aid that goes through Jordan. And it was ready to issue visas to Syrians, imagine this, to come into Israel to help coordinate the aid. So the Multi-Faith Alliance, which is the organization I founded to do this work, became the IDF's largest partner in this operation. When Operation Good Neighbor was first announced, the general who was in charge of the operation came to New York for the UN Security Council meetings in search of partners to operationalize Operation Good Neighbor. And he came up empty. I suspect, once again, because of the politics and attitudes toward Israel, this very one-dimensional view of Israel, which gets in the way of all kinds of things.
Even in America?
not so much in America.
No.
But yes,
Yes.
not as much as in Europe, I
Yeah.
have to say that.
Yeah, yeah.
But yes, in the US,
Yeah.
there are also
Yeah.
perceptions like that. So I happened to be the last meeting that he had before he
Yeah.
returned to Israel. And within 5 minutes, because of the Multi-Faith Alliance, I mean, we have more than 100 partner organizations,
Yeah.
I was immediately able to connect him
Yes.
with potential partners.
Yeah.
And here is where the man bites dog story comes in. The very first organizations to take advantage of the opening of the Golan Channel were Syrian organizations. And you have to picture this. So Syrian organizations were now shipping enormous cargo containers of aid to Israel. Their logos on their cargo containers arriving in Haifa and Ashdod. And from there, the IDF, Israeli soldiers, would pick up the goods that the Syrian organizations were delivering, would transship them through Israel to the Golan Heights. And at the Golan Heights, our partners on the ground in Syria would then distribute the goods throughout southwest Syria.
That's extraordinary.
And in this way, we were able to provide the residents, many of whom were displaced, with the emergency goods that they needed. We were able to support and supply 3 medical facilities, a bakery, which produced 15,000 pitas a day. Israel provided water and fuel and electricity, and we sourced the goods that needed to be delivered.
And who had funded the Syrian containerfuls? Where did that money come from?
Well, we paid for the shipping.
Yes.
We sourced the goods.
Right.
Our partners on the ground in Syria would tell us what was needed.
Yes.
It's not that, we just held random clothing drives, for
Yeah, yeah,
example, or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
We were given lists of things that were needed.
Yes.
We then sourced the goods.
Yeah.
The goods were donated,
Yeah.
and then they would be shipped. Now, some of the Syrian organizations had their own sources
Yeah.
for goods.
Yes.
But in this way, we were able to deliver, up until that time, $120 million worth of aid directly into Syria.
Yes.
But as important as that, what we were actually doing was practicing humanitarian diplomacy. Because as a result of this, that entire area was stabilized for the duration of the time that these operations were going on.
Yeah. And how long a duration was that?
It was for 2 years.
Yes.
Now, it was stabilized because the extremists couldn't get a foothold, because people were getting the things that they needed. We were helping to support a rudimentary economy. We were working through local councils. And as you know, the way that extremist groups take hold is, first they provide the services that the governments are not. They fill that void. And that's how Hamas got established. That's what Hezbollah did to get established. Al-Qaeda, ISIS. They provided the goods and the services. But because we were doing that, extremist groups didn't get a foothold.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in fact, an article was written about how that was the only part of Syria that was working at the time.
Yes.
Now, in 2018, that operation had to be shut down as part of an agreement that was made with Russia. And that agreement allowed the regime with its allies, Iran and Russia, to mount an offensive that took over the entirety of southwest Syria. Now, that did not stop us.
Did you shed a tear?
Of course, because the partnerships that we had developed were so powerful.
Yeah.
The changes in attitude, the changes in the way sworn enemies were now perceiving each other was dramatic.
Yeah.
And we felt it was very important to preserve those partnerships, and we are in fact still working on doing that. But when we could no longer make deliveries into the southwest, we expanded our delivery area, and we are now making deliveries to the northeast and the northwest of Syria. We've now, as of now, delivered $220 million worth of aid, and still counting. And over 2 million Syrian war victims have benefited from that aid. We have also, since the Golan Channel, we have opened an office in Raqqa, which used to be the ISIS stronghold.
Yes.
And we also have 2 medical facilities, which have seen an enormous number of patients in the north of Syria.
So how did you make that move from the southwest? I mean, you say it very casually, we just expanded in the northwest and northeast. I don't think that was the work of half an hour. How did you find these new partnerships in such a fragmented country?
Well, I mentioned earlier a Syrian refugee who did this roadshow with the Israeli NGO founder and myself. That Syrian refugee has since become the executive director of the Multi-Faith Alliance.
Right.
Shadi Martini is his name.
Yeah.
Shadi used to be a hospital administrator in Aleppo and is part of a very prominent Israeli, he would not say he was part of a prominent Israeli family, part of a prominent Syrian family, although he has now been to Israel a number of times.
Yes.
But Shadi is extraordinarily knowledgeable and extraordinarily well connected.
Yes.
I have to say that for myself, being a Jewish woman from New York, I would not have been able to do any of this without Shadi, because he is the one with the great knowledge of Syria. And with that, I'd like to make another point, because I know, Sir Tom, that you are very deeply engaged in philanthropy. And so there are a number of lessons in philanthropy that I learned along my journey.
Please share them with us.
So one of them is something called empowered humility. As a philanthropist, I felt empowered to do something. I felt empowered because I felt commanded to do it by Leviticus 19:16, which I mentioned before. But I also understood what I didn't know. I was really wandering into territory that was completely unfamiliar to me. And I did on-the-job training. But part of the humility was understanding that I really needed the advice of somebody who had been there and done that and experienced what was going on in Syria. So that's certainly one lesson for philanthropy. Just because we feel empowered to make change doesn't mean that we know how to do it.
So I love the memoir that Carnegie wrote at the end of his life. And there's a sentence that I carry with me all the time, which is always surround yourself with people who know more than you do. And so that's two great philanthropists now, you and Carnegie, who've said the same thing to me. Although, of course, I never met him.
Thank you. I hadn't realized he said the same thing. So thank you for educating me. This is humility
exactly.
again. Yes, not only people who know more than you do, but also forming partnerships
Yes.
that help you advance your work.
Yes.
And the partnerships that I formed and that we formed were absolutely essential to doing the work. We would not have been able to get anything done without these partners.
Yes. And were some of your partners actually living in Syria?
Yes.
Living in the majority of them? Some of them?
A good number of them.
A good number,
yes.
yeah.
I mean, the partners we work with on the ground in the north, I think are entirely based in Syria.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about danger? I mean, the people who you were working with were putting their lives on the line in many ways, weren't they?
Absolutely, especially the ones who were working with Israelis.
Yeah.
And that's the reason that Israel was very reluctant to go public with this, because they were very concerned that the Syrians would have targets on their back.
Yes.
But it's very heartening, and for me a great sign of hope, that eventually dissolved. Because eventually the Syrians who were receiving aid realized that it was coming through Israel. It was being facilitated by Israel. And eventually they came to welcome it and to seek it because they urgently needed this aid. And an interesting thing happened. Given their indoctrination, their preconceptions about Israel, they said, wait a minute, it's not the Israelis who are driving us off our land. It's not the Israelis who are killing us. It's our own government.
Yeah.
So if that was a lie, what else was a lie?
Yeah.
And the proof of the pudding is in what happened in Arab media. One of our main Syrian partners decided on his own to go public. He happened to control a media empire, including the most popular TV station in Syria. He's now based in Dubai because he was forced to flee.
Yeah.
It's not a government television station. And he aired a 45-minute interview with 3 of the Syrians who were working with Israelis, and they talked about their work. Al Jazeera picked up the story and bashed these Syrians as traitors. But when they put the story on their Facebook page, if you saw the comments coming from Arabs, 99% in Arabic, they bashed Al Jazeera for bashing these Syrians because they thought the help that Israel was giving was very important, and it was help they weren't seeing from other places. So you could see this gradual change in attitudes. And Shadi, who is, I mentioned Shadi several times already, he tells a story of having gone back into Syria to visit a longtime friend of his, a close friend. And he saw his friend with the long beard and a black and white banner behind him and said, "What happened to you?" Because his friend had never been particularly religious. And he said, "You know, nothing happened. I just do this because if you're extreme, they give you money and weapons. And if you're moderate, you don't get anything." He said, "I haven't changed." And Shadi said, "Well, you know, I want to share something with you that I really haven't told anybody yet." And his friend got very concerned and said, "Well, what is it?" And Shadi said, "Well, you know, I've been working with Israelis." And his friend said, "Israelis? "Oh, that's fine. I thought you were going to say that you had joined Hezbollah." I said, "Oh, absolutely. Listen, bring them over for lunch next time."
No, isn't that nice? That's wonderful.
So this, to me, is the most gratifying
Yes.
part of all of it.
Yes.
The bridges, the
Yes,
bridges that get built
Yeah.
when people come to see each other as human beings.
Yeah. Can we go back to bridges? I mean, you told us about how when you set off to find your entry point, I don't think you're an easy person to say no to, but...
People tell me that, but I get turned down all the time.
Yeah, well, I'm joining the club, but sometimes we get a yes, don't we?
Sometimes.
But do you think the people you went to see at the beginning get it now? I mean, are you now getting support from Canada or Europe or North America in a way that you weren't 5, 6, 7 years ago?
No, we actually don't get any funding from any governments.
Yeah. Maybe it's better in a way that you don't.
It does have its advantages,
Yes. Yeah.
but the really big money does come from government, and we actually are hoping that maybe we will get some help for our
Good.
work in the Northeast and the Northwest.
Yeah.
But up until now, we have not received any money from governments. The first people that I went to did get it.
Yeah.
Immediately.
Yeah.
And they were all Jewish.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
They got it immediately.
Yeah.
When I first wanted to start the work, I
Yeah.
happened to be in Jerusalem at the same time as the president and CEO of the Joint Distribution Committee. And I said to him, "Alan, you know, I'm not seeing a Jewish communal response to the Syrian crisis, and we really must do something." He said immediately, "You are absolutely right." And within a couple of weeks, we had initiated the Jewish Coalition for Syrian Refugees.
Fantastic.
And that became the core of what eventually became the Multi-Faith Alliance
Yeah.
for Syrian Refugees. Even before I spoke to Alan, I was at the annual board retreat of the Jewish Funders Network. I guess this would have been in 2013. And I was sitting with some of my colleagues chatting over lunch, and he said, "You know," I said, "I have this idea. And what do you think?" They thought it was all terrific. And a number of them ended up becoming strong supporters of the Multi-Faith Alliance.
Yeah.
So again, it goes to show the misconceptions and the preconceptions that we have about people
Yeah.
can often be deadly, deadly wrong.
Yes.
As counterintuitive as you would think that it would be Jews who
Yeah.
would be supporting this effort
Yeah.
to help Syrians. You know, that's where the hope lies. Early on, I had meetings with the heads of some Syrian organizations that are based in Washington. And I almost fell off my chair when I heard from a couple of them. One said, "Thank God for Israel,"
Yeah.
and the other said, "The Jews are our greatest allies."
Yeah.
I mean,
So-
how would you expect to hear anything like that?
Well, yeah. I'm unsurprised. I mean, certainly in this country, the generosity of the Jewish faith to philanthropy is quite extraordinary and sometimes embarrassing by dint of its proportionality to the Jewish population of this country. I suppose in 5 years' time, if we have the chance to do this again, I would be saying to you, your Multi-Faith Alliance has been an amazing success. I do hope it's more multi-faith money that keeps it going. Can I ask you?
It is more diverse now.
It is, hooray.
It is more diverse, but I do have to say that the bulk of the funds still do come from the Jewish community.
Well, it's lovely to be talking to you here in a multi-faith centre, and we'll certainly at Marshall and indeed.
I actually gave the inaugural lecture when
Did you?
when the Faith
Oh,
Center
that's so nice.
opened. So I'm very pleased that we're back here now.
Good. I have a final question for you. For those of us who have stood idly by, and I confess that I have in this context, and I'm embarrassed to say, what would your advice be to us as to how we can, even in a micro way, make a difference to Syrian refugees, or refugees generally?
Well, I'll recap some of the points that I made during this delightful conversation with you. My experience is that everybody wants to help. People really do want to help, but they just don't know how. So the first advice that I would give is don't look at the big picture. Because if you focus on the big picture, you will be paralyzed into inaction. Because with a crisis as overwhelming as the Syrian crisis, you'll just shrug your shoulders and say, there's nothing I can do. So it is important to find an entry point. In the UK, there are a number of entry points. There are organizations that are set up to welcome refugees. That can certainly be an entry point. There are 5 pillars to successful integration once refugees arrive here. Housing, work, language, education, and trauma treatment. These are all things that can be provided by volunteers. And it's very, very important that all of those services be provided to refugees. The UK, a survey was done, and that showed that about 25% of the population in the UK is opposed to refugees and immigration, and I guess Brexit is a good illustration of that, and 25% very supportive of refugees and immigration. Then you have the 50% that the survey referred to as the anxious middle. Those who are afraid, they just have fear. And there are 3 great fears that interfere with rational and humane policies toward refugees. That's fear of a negative economic impact. It's very easy to debunk all these fears, by the way, but I don't think we have the time for me to do it in this interview. Fear of terrorism and Islamophobia in the case of refugees coming from Muslim-majority countries. But once those fears are addressed, and once you do the right kind of messaging that moves the needle, that anxious middle can actually turn out to be very, very helpful. So don't look at the big picture, find an entry point, identify a gap, stay focused on something doable. Find partners, and don't let ego get in the way.
And perhaps to conclude, why don't you remind us of that verse from Leviticus again?
Thou shalt not stand idly by while the blood of your neighbor cries out from the earth.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely to talk to you.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.